Today is a very, very special day because West Berkshire community is actually coming together and listening to what people with dementia say and what they need and how we can improve our services, our products, our businesses to actually cater and make our community more inclusive for people living with dementia and also their carers as well. When you create a society that's actually more inclusive for people with dementia are suffering from cognitive, sensory and physical impairment. You're actually creating a more inclusive society in total. And that's for people with autism, people with Parkinson's, people with a lot of other different issues to do with cognitive impairment. So the more we can actually make our environment suitable for people with dementia, the more inclusive it is for absolutely everybody. So I'm going to just cover briefly the flow of today, like the agenda, who's speaking and so on. I'm just going to go over that very briefly. I'm going to talk a little bit about who the DAA actually is, and then I'm going to give you the words of people who live with dementia or are affected by dementia, and this is actually coming from statements within the DAA when it originally formed and the purpose of it. So this is really about the voice of people living with dementia and their carers. And everybody in this room actually plays a critical role. And sometimes we walk out and we think, actually, what can I do? But the more people understand about dementia, the more they understand the stigma associated with dementia, the more they understand that anybody in this room could be affected by dementia. And the more we can empathize and the more we can actually tailor and embrace people with dementia, the fairer our society is going to be. And that's a big part of what today is about. And everybody in here can go away with a personal plan to say, what can I do differently within my service, within my business, within my personal life to make situations better for people living with dementia? And that's really what it's about. It's the start of something. This is not the end. We're not going to have all the answers here today. Today is about sharing with you that there is best practice out there. There's best practice in policing, best practice in ambulance and fire brigade, best practice in memory clinics, in acute hospitals, best practice in social care, best practice in businesses and everything. And you're not going to get all those answers today. But today is about stepping over the stigma associated with dementia, understanding that there is something that you can actually do, and then going away and researching what is the best practice that's available globally or within the UK, and can I implement that to make a fairer society within West Berkshire? Now, ironically, the thing about dementia is you're going to see it, and you're going to see it referred to in a couple of the presentations, is the scale of dementia. I mean, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes, but it costs more than stroke, heart, and cancer combined. And today, there's over 850,000 people in the UK affected by dementia. And there's estimated to be about 650,000 carers also working within this area. And the projections are that it's going to grow to over 2.1 million people affected by 2050. And today, it's already taxing our resources. It costs about £26 billion to manage it today. So you can imagine now when it's going to grow to over 2.1 million. And if we keep ignoring it and not actually having a more integrated approach to dementia, integrated services, keeping people living at home longer, keeping people healthier, keeping people more engaged in their community, what's going to end up happening, what is happening today with a more fragmented approach is it's costing our health and social care system a lot of money, and we're not going to be able to sustain it as it continues to grow. And that's one part of the trauma. The other part of it is, from an emotional point of view and from a financial point of view, the impact on families and individuals is enormous. And the bit that I struggle with, and I've just completed a fellowship in brain health recently, is the inequity that some of the people with dementia actually face from a health point of view. Because people with dementia can walk into a room and they look perfectly normal, we don't seem to tailor our health services and our social care services and so on. I think we need to do a lot more on that area. There's a lot more we can actually do to make society a little bit more equitable for people living with dementia. So in the small print, the day is set up, and you're not expected to read this, you all have it in your in your handouts and everything else, so hopefully you can figure it out. And I'm not going to walk through it in any great detail either. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a coffee break at 11, as Vicky said. We're having lunch at 1 o'clock, and that's going to run through to about 1:45. Then we're going to come back into this room at 1:45. And then Sue's going to talk about dementia-friendly communities in the afternoon. But one of the key exercises here is a workshop where we're going to have mixed delegates at different tables during this workshop for about 3/4 of an hour about what each individual can do, what has today meant for them, and what can you take away from today. And we're going to ask you to put that on a jigsaw puzzle piece, and there's a tree out in the lobby that we're going to ask you to hang that on so that we can actually put all the bits of the puzzles together with all of the different commitments from everybody. Now, I'd also ask you to make a personal note of it so that you actually remember what you hung on the tree, so that when we go away that we actually have something concrete to deal with. So that's really the workshop. It really is to say, what can I start to do? Can I go and research best practice? Can I do something different? How can I make the world slightly more inclusive? So the DAA it was established in 2010, and there's 150 DAAs around the country at the moment. And as I mentioned before, it's about connecting, sharing best practice, and taking action on dementia. There's no point everybody in this room trying to reinvent the wheel when best practice actually sits out there. And it takes a little bit of research to figure out in your area what is the best practice. And the other area is within the DAA, we every quarter sit down and we have forums in Pangbourne, we have forums in patient forums and forums in Lambourne as well, and in Newbury and in Thatcham. And what we do is we get the feedback coming in about what's happening in society, what's working, what's not working on a regular basis. And one of the things we keep hearing is that every time a person is diagnosed with dementia, both their family and them are actually impacted quite heavily from an emotional point of view. But then it seems somehow, and I know everybody's doing their best, but there's something not quite joined up here. They have to go through the learning curve of how to cope. And we shouldn't do this because there's thousands of people with dementia. And every family shouldn't face this like it's the first time that we've ever had dementia in West Berkshire. The learning curve, we need to bring up the learning curve to take some of the trauma out of the diagnosis of dementia, to actually help people and guide them where they should go and where to get the best services and support and so on. Everything we do is in partnership and informed by people living with dementia and those that care for them. That's basically what the DAA is about, and it is a voluntary body. We were formed in 2010, and I know Alistair Burns had a big part in the formation of the DAA, and I know Ian Sheriff, who's also talking here, was a big part of the formation of Dementia Friends and dementia-friendly environments or communities. We have the DAA West Berkshire was formed in 2017, and this is actually following on from the original formation of the DAA in Newbury, which was actually in 2014. So it's relatively new in our community. And today our members continue to make commitments using collective expertise, influence government policy, and society's attitudes towards dementia. And that's really what we're about. It's the voice of people living with dementia and their carers. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to feed that through to all of the different bodies, businesses, public services, and so on. So the purpose of today, you'll have an understanding of the challenges faced by people living with dementia and their carers account on a daily basis in our community. Every invitee, as I said, has a part to play. Only working together are we going to actually change this. Each individual doing their part, and then if we can actually manage to get a coordinated strategy across West Berkshire, that would be the icing on the cake. But the first stop would be if everybody actually took away and worked out what is actually best practice. The second step would be how do we get a more integrated strategy across West Berkshire. And if we face this challenge together, community activation, which this is pure community activation, what we're doing today. All of the businesses supported us, all of the different services, all of the public services, everybody has supported it. It's all voluntary, and this is true community activation. And as I said earlier, the challenge is actually too big and too important not to have all stakeholders involved. And we will work towards a more equitable society. So just under the UN Convention of Rights, Persons with Disabilities, Article 19, recognises the right of all persons with disabilities to live independently and be included in the community. And sometimes we're not actually recognising dementia as a disability. And it's not always a disability, but we really need to understand what does a cognitive impairment mean and how does that actually affect somebody on a day-to-day basis and their ability to cope. What does that mean when they're going to the dentist? What does that mean when they're going to the optician? What does that mean when they're coming into town? How does that affect them? What does it mean when they're going shopping? What do they need? What's the difference? And sometimes we sit down and it's quite straightforward. Somebody with a physical impairment, an occupational therapist would walk in and say, we need to change the bathroom and we're going to alter it around. But actually, somebody with a cognitive impairment can be just as disabled cognitively as somebody is physically. But we can't see it, so we just need to understand it a little bit more how it affects. And as a result of really not recognising as a disability, we have people being excluded from our community, and we're actually incurring higher health and social care costs. So these are the statements from the DAA when it was formed in 2010. This is people giving feedback about what they would like to see in our society. And one of the things about it is, I sometimes look at the inverse of what they're actually saying here. Okay, this is the positive statement. You also have to then read the opposite of what's actually being said. So the we in this is people living with dementia, their carers, their families, and everybody affected by dementia when you actually start looking at these statements. So independence, interdependence, and dependence. We have the right to be recognised as who we are, to make choices about our lives, including taking risks and contribute to society. Our diagnosis should not define us, nor should we be ashamed of it. So if you read the opposite to that, we're not being recognised in our society, and we're not being given the right to take risk, and we're not being given a number of other elements. So this is something that people were aspiring to, and this is the voice of the DAA. Community isolation. We have the right to continue with day-to-day and family life without discrimination or unfair cost, to be accepted and included in our communities, and not to live in isolation or loneliness. So again, read the opposite to that if you want to as well. Carers. We have the right to an early and accurate diagnosis and to receive evidence-based, appropriate, compassionate and properly funded care and treatment from trained people who understand us and how dementia affects us. This must meet our needs wherever we live. Research, we'd like to be involved in research. Now, I'm going to quickly just go through some of it's always important to listen to what people are saying and what they're actually looking for. And what I'd like to also then do is just balance it on the other side and talk about the economic impact that we actually have here. So the cost and prevalence of dementia. Dementia costs more than heart, stroke and cancer combined. There's 50 million people with dementia globally at the moment. It's costing over $1 trillion today. It has the potential to actually bankrupt a lot of Western society countries at the moment. And the biggest growth is happening in the developing world. They are expecting that it's going to grow to over 152 million by 2050 at a cost of over 3 trillion. UK, I mentioned earlier, 850,000 people with dementia, growing to over 2.1 million people. West Berkshire, we have 1,656 people over the age of 65, and there's about 10% more that are under 65 with early onset dementia. And the youngest person that I've heard about with dementia is actually 18 years of age, and is a boy who lives in Kenya. So it's not something that just affects it's not to do with age. It is actually an underlying disease, and as we age, the disease starts to impact at a later stage, but it can actually affect us earlier. We anticipate that there's going to be over 2,500 people by 2025 at an estimated cost of £79 million in West Berkshire. Now, these are some of the more details. So they're all big numbers, and everybody sort of says, oh, billions, millions, skillions, all the rest of it. Does it actually affect us on a day-to-day basis? But actually, 66% of people with dementia live in our community, actually in the community. Up to 40% of beds in acute hospitals are actually occupied by people with dementia. 40% of people who enter hospital from their home diagnosed with dementia are discharged to a care home because they deteriorate within the hospital system. Residential care costs about £25,000 a year more than living at home with care. 70 to 80% of residents in a standard care home have dementia, whether it's diagnosed or undiagnosed. And 60% of care home residents fall, half of whom fall repeatedly. And then we get into the overuse of antipsychotics can lead to increased falls, injuries, and a doubling of the risk of mortality, an increased risk of stroke by up to 3 times. And then last but not least, which is the one that I struggle with a lot, is people with dementia receive 50% less pain medication than the equivalent age in the general population. And that's even when it comes to palliative care and when it comes to death. So we really have to think about how can we be a lot more consistent in our services, in our approach, in our policies, in our care pathways, so that everybody gets a similar experience and it's not dependent on who actually shows up to look after somebody with dementia, that we get a lot more care. Now, if you think about all of those numbers, the reason I put those numbers up there is not to sort of bamboozle you, but it's to say that's with 850,000 people. When this grows to 2.1 million people, how do you start increasing those numbers of the percentage of beds in acute hospitals, the number of people that we're actually trying to care for? It's going to overwhelm the system if we don't actually start to work together and each individual person take action on this one. So by understanding and standing together, we can build a more inclusive society, helping reduce health and social care costs and inequities. With that, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Jill Creswell, who's consultant psychiatrist at the West Berkshire Memory Clinic. Thank you.